despite all our bombasts, despite the billions of dollars, we weren't smart in how we supported Ukraine. We didn't understand Putin and flood that battlefield with US weapons. That's what I would do if I was Biden in the remaining 2 months. And now we're talking about negotiating. Trump's coming in talking about negotiating. You don't, as Churchill said, you don't negotiate with a lion when your head is in his mouth. My feeling is money is cheap compared to lives. I don't give a shit how much money we, United States, spend on alliances. It's still cheap, right? NATO is worth it. NATO's worth it even if no one else steps up to the plate.
Hello and welcome to Der Heilige Stuhl, the podcast with Alex and Jörn. And today with our second video podcast with a very special and amazing guest, Andy Milburn, former Colonel of the United States Marine Corps, is here to discuss with us about British food, Ukraine, and American politics. And I wish a very warm welcome to Andy and a very warm welcome, half warm, to Alex.
Hey, fellas, thanks so much for having me. And I think we can skip the British food part of this because I really don't have anything positive to say. And nice. All right, well, fellas, I know we had by the way, I'm delighted to be on. Really am. Some of the, honestly, I'm not just saying this, the happiest years of my career were spent in Germany, in Stuttgart area. Loved it there. I know we're not going to talk about that, but nevertheless, I want to get that out there before your guests hate me. But go ahead.
Totally fine. So actually, my first questions to kick it off is, obviously, we discussed before, and you were essentially British. So I'm sure many people have asked you, but how actually did you end up in the United States Marine Corps and not in the Royal Marines, for example, in Great Britain?
Yeah, that is a great question. I get asked that a lot, and a very quick answer: the British Army would not have me. I broke my leg playing rugby at university. I went to University College in London, and it still doesn't bend 90 degrees. And the British Army said, you're not fit for purpose. They gave me like the lowest category of physical, whatever it is. It's like a 4F. Don't come back. So,
right.
But I was, as you point out, I was a dual national. My mother was American and was kind enough to get me a U.S. passport when I was a kid. So I was eligible to go into the U.S. military. You have to be a U.S. citizen unless you're a legal resident. And so I enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps in London back in 1987. So remember, that was during the Cold War, and same thing in Germany. Remember, there were American bases all across Europe, especially in Germany. And the United States military had two big recruiting centers, one in Frankfurt and one in London. And so I got brought into one in London. And the Marine recruiter, was the first guy I met. And, he talked up a good game. I had already run into Marines in Pakistan when I was traveling. I did a lot of traveling when I was in college. I traveled across Pakistan, Iran, basically all around the world. Like a lot of European kids, backpacking was the thing back in the 80s. And I ran into these Marines in the embassy in Islamabad. Now, anyone now who's a Marine will tell you those weren't. They were Marines, but they were on a sabbatical. They were living a great life. They were working for the U.S. State Department, not for the Marine Corps. So they had this luxurious house with a pool, tennis courts. They invited me to a party. There were many women there, which was something that was intriguing to me at the age of 19. And and I thought, this is a good life. I was a law student at the time, but I thought I can take 4 years off. I'll finish law school. I can always come back and practice and make a ton of money, but I'm going to take 4 years and spend them in the United States Marine Corps, which is probably quite an unusual decision for a law student, but you see where I was coming from.
Actually, quite interesting.
Sorry, too lengthy an answer.
No, not really. Actually, Alexander studied law as well to some degree, so we have quite a similarity.
No, Thank you, Jörn. Thank you very much.
He hates it when I say that. Yeah.
I'm not a lawyer. I'm a patent attorney, and now I'm what everybody is. I'm a consultant.
But a consultant now, but you actually worked as a patent attorney.
I worked as a patent attorney. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, so a couple of things. Kudos to you from jumping from a very tech field to another tech field, but making it interesting, right? So you're combining it with the powers to argue, to analyze. So you can't be a social misfit as an attorney. You can be as a techie. You're combining those two. I never practiced. I want to say that up front. The only time I ever practiced was time and again in the Marine Corps when people found out I had been to law school and I was given what we call preliminary investigations, which are whenever anything goes wrong, basically you're doing the initial investigation to decide what comes next, whether it needs to go to something more serious. And those things are a pain in the ass. So it certainly counted against me.
Is this already part of the military jurisdiction the U.S. Army and Navy and military has, or these preliminary?
It's just a procedure that you go through that we do. If you're in an infantry battalion, right? Let's just say you're an infantry battalion, you're in Iraq. I'm going to use a little more dramatic example. I mean, you have to do a preliminary investigation for lost equipment over a certain amount of money, right? But say you're in Iraq and something happens. Someone makes an allegation that a Marine has been abusive to a local. Okay, before that gets turned over for a formal investigation, it used to be that you would conduct an investigation initially of what happened, to see if it was something that needed to be pursued. But it couldn't be within your chain of command. Now, I believe the rules have changed now, and that commanders no longer have the authority to conduct preliminary investigations, primarily because of all the problems with sexual assault, right, in the U.S. military. In the military, I imagine every country in the world, right? And so the feeling at governmental level was that you couldn't trust the military to do those preliminary investigations anymore, because they were always going to slant things in favor of the accused. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying that was the perception. So it's been taken out of the hands of guys like me. But before that happened, it would be someone like me who showed up to start asking questions and then wrote up a report saying, hey, I think there's something substantive here. We need to pursue it, or nothing to see here. I think that we can take care of this in-house with administrative punishments.
Yeah, quite interesting.
And actually, my question would be law and joining the Marines. I wouldn't say it's a contradiction, but do you always want it to be like in the field, or do you basically saw yourself sort of more as the command post guy, or do you have any preference?
Well, I absolutely, by the way, my initial degree was in philosophy, because of course in the UK, as in most countries, when you do law, it's not your initial degree. So I'm the only philosopher I've ever met in the Marine Corps, and there's not a natural correlation. But and I, my speciality was political philosophy, and I wrote, anyway, it doesn't matter. Marx and Engels was my thing. I read. So that made me an oddity to start with. But to your point, when I joined the Marine Corps, I wanted to immerse myself in the experience. Right, I knew I was only going to for 4 years. I thought I was going to come back and do law, so I signed up for the infantry. And the recruiter bullshitted me. So that's really difficult to get in the infantry. Well, in the Marines, everyone goes in the infantry, and unless you've shown a modicum of intelligence, in which case you might be put somewhere else. But even if you've been promised something else and you screw up and do something wrong, they put you in the infantry. So it wasn't really such a hard bargain that I was driving as I thought. But that's what I wanted, and that was always what interested me. Why join the Marine Corps? Why join the Marine Corps and do something else, right? And I'm not criticizing the incoming vice president. J.D. Vance, but he joined the Marine Corps to be a public affairs officer.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, who does that? I mean, if you're going to do that and you just want to troll around with journalists and brief them, join the Air Force. Better food, people treat you better. You don't have to go through boot camp. But if you're going to join the Marines, you join to be a Marine, and every Marine's a rifleman. And so that's what I signed up for, and that was my career track. I had a 5-year window to go back to study. If I wanted to practice law, I had a 5-year window in which to do it. And by then I had picked up the dizzy heights of corporal. That's a joke. That's like this, it's right above private. But and then being selected for a commission, and I just realized I really like what I'm doing. And I was immersed, to answer your question, just in the field side of it. And that's the way where I remained. I was an infantry officer throughout, except for the last 10 years. I went to special operations, Marine special operations, which is very small. We have less than 1,000 operators, special operators in the whole of the Marine Corps, compared to the Army that has 28,000 guys in their special forces, or even the SEALs, which are like, I don't know, they're huge too, 5,000. Someone's going to shoot.
Can you explain for the German audience what that position actually means? What do those guys actually do, basically?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try and keep this short and entertaining as possible.
Yeah, you can basically shoot.
Hey, listen. So the Marine Corps is massive. The Marine Corps is bigger than any European army. If the Marine Corps Air Wing alone, if it was an Air Force, would be the 5th largest Air Force in the world. All right. So, during my time in the Marines, the size of the Marine Corps varied between a high of 202,000 at the height of the Iraq War. I'm going to say that again, 202,000, down to, about 170,000. Now, don't get me wrong, it is an elite. And I'm not just saying that as propaganda. I've been involved in the training system, and it's extraordinary. You can ask me, how do you keep an organization that big elite? It's elite in the sense of it maintains very high standards, I think, across the board. And my British compatriots, they are compatriots, but colleagues actually agree with me. I think it's quite masterful, the way the Marine Corps does that. But it's not special operations, and their infantry are just regular infantry dudes. They're good, but they're just regular light infantry. So in 2006, at the height of the Iraq War, the then Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, said, "Hey, Marine Corps, you're going to have a special operations." And the Marine Corps hummed it hard and said, "Hey, we are all special. We don't need to do this." And he said, "No, shut the fuck up. You're going to have special operations." So what happened is, first of all, we had to figure out what they were going to look like, what the mission was. And bottom line is, what do Marines do? Marines focus on amphibious assault. Well, the initial feeling then was that Marine special operations would be focusing kind of on littoral operations. The SEALs are out in the ocean. The Army special forces are on land, and you have the Marines who are doing like advanced force operations before an assault, an amphibious assault, for instance. Okay, but as soon as the Marine special operations component was formed, it was very small, as I said. We realized, hey, we're all doing the same thing in Iraq and Afghanistan. Even the SEALs, forget about swimming around and doing all that shit. We're all doing counterinsurgency. So we better be really good at that in order to make a name for ourselves. And so that's what Marine Special Operations really focused on, was counterinsurgency. And the Marine Corps itself has a tradition in counterinsurgency. They have a tradition in working with partner nation forces, learning the language, being culturally adept, all of that stuff. When it's not all about running around shooting people between the eyes. It's about by, with, and through, we call it, working with Iraqis, and you name it. And I've worked South Americans, Eastern Europeans. I've done all of that. Filipinos, Indonesians. in order to attain your goals, your national security goals. Well, in Iraq and Afghanistan, that became working with, especially in Afghanistan, the Afghan Special Operations Forces, and the pattern was this: the pattern for special operations, both with us and the Army, was it was based on a concept that was actually developed in Vietnam called the Civil Action Program, and what you put like a squad, a Marine Special Operations team, 12 to 14 guys, right, in a village, an Afghan village, and they would work with the local police, they would work with the local Special Operations Forces, but they work with the villagers too to gain their trust. You'd have among those, like every member of that team could speak Pashto, some more fluently than others, but they could all get by, right? You'd still use interpreters. But we realized language was very important. We had to put that in our training pipeline. Yes, these guys were super fit. Yes, they were multi-talented. They went through a very grueling assessment and selection course, and then we put them through an 8-month training course. And remember, these are experienced Marines when they come in. In order to come into the Marine Special Operations, you had to do at least 2 combat deployments, have done well there, and be a senior lieutenant minimum or a corporal. So we were already dealing with a high quality raw material, and you have to, because of course that kind of environment is you're making I think a huge difference with a small amount of guys, but at the same time it is very, very hazardous. And within that team you've got intelligence guys, you've got dog handlers, you've got EOD, bomb disposal guys. So as I said, you've got all of these talents in a very small team.
Alex, do you want to ask something? Otherwise, I'll go ahead.
I'm totally flashed. It's I had some connections to my own career when you told that you were not fit enough for the British military. That's how I got into the artillery troop at first, and I changed to the Fallschirmjäger while I was studying, and so I became paratrooper after my studies. Because of the same reasons you mentioned. Well, I want to do this because, let's use the word, it's cool. It's a cool job. These guys do cool stuff. And so I decided to serve my last 5 years in Zweibrücken near Baumholder. Large training area.
So I'm going to mispronounce it, but Fallschirmjäger.
Yes,
right? Is paratrooper.
Airborne infantry.
So very, very interestingly, I know. I mean, in the US, every country they have their own kind of culture. You're probably aware. In the US, it gets subsumed in massive 82nd Airborne, and they turn a fun sport like parachuting into something that is just so tedious and boring, just like the military does with everything. But I did get a chance to jump with German, what is it? The Special Forces. Is it KSK?
Yep, KSK.
Yeah. And it was an extraordinary experience. It was a lot of fun. I really liked their they had a great sense of humor. They broke all of our stereotypes about Germans. They were very funny and frighteningly so, and it was a great experience.
A lot of stereotypes are true about Germans, I find, like punctuality, and we do use our towels to mark our places at the swimming pool, and basic stuff like this. That's real, right? But I imagine we have more humor than the average person would think. And
I agree. It's a different sort of humor, so foreigners don't always understand it.
Yeah, and also
it's
like
a very funny sense of humor.
Yeah, and also like obviously Germans are super direct, so and Germans make jokes to other Germans, so that affects the kind of humor as well. But it's like with every country, and actually we go very well with British. I find like Brits find us very funny. We find British people very funny, if I may speak for 82 million people, which of course I can.
Well, why not?
That is very true, and that is probably why I felt like a German. I found the German sense of humor funny because I grew up in the UK, and in Britain, humor is everything. Humor is a release, and especially in the military. And the worse things get, the more jokes you hear. Now in the States, that is a little bit different. In the States, constantly in my career, I found that people were underestimating me or thinking that I was a jokester, because that was the way I resorted to things. Now, the guys who worked for me, I think loved it, because you don't want a boss who's always serious and reminding you of how serious the world is. Like, Marines don't need to be reminded when they're up to their waist in shit and having people shoot at them. They don't need to be reminded that things are bad. You know, they'd rather have a guy who is joking around, and Brits understand that. The Americans don't always. So paradoxically, I guess I'm saying the Americans are the one nationality that I come across that I felt kind of lacked a sense of humor. Oh, and the Russians too.
And yet the Americans elected a joke as the president. What's your take on that?
Well, hey, yeah, you know, what I'm doing right now is I'm a silver lining guy. Okay, so no, I didn't vote for this president, and you know, I voted for what it's worth, Biden and Harris, and by American standards, I'm a lefty. Even though I spent 31 years in the Marine Corps, and
so you're more of a Sanders person.
No. I mean, simply because it's the Sanders. I see that. I mean, you've got to know the country, and you've got to know your audience, right? So that's why I say no. I'm not a Sanders person, because I think he is. Yes, he's an idealist. I'm not knocking him as a person by any means. He's a tremendous individual, but I don't think he has clue one about how Americans think. And that is the problem. Okay. And that's why the Democratic Party lost this election. And I'm furious at them, absolutely furious, but it was theirs to lose. They've lost, and they have not fixed themselves since 2016. Okay. That's enough on domestic politics. Looking ahead, all right, and I'm just trying to make I'm trying to make not the best of a bad situation. I don't want, but I look at silver linings. So my frustrations when it came to foreign policy with the Biden administration, and by the way, I've written critically about both parties, both governments, but the things that really began to become a trend were this kind of absolute disconnection with understanding of foreign policy. And I'm probably going to alienate some of your listeners here, but I just being honest, I voted for Obama, but I was horrified at Obama's foreign policy. In my mind, what has happened in Syria, the 500,000 lives that have been lost, the 11 million people that have been displaced, come down to American pusillanimous. What is the word I'm looking for in English, guys? Pusillanimity.
What?
Weakness. Yeah, weakness. Okay. I mean, think about it. Obama said clearly, hey, there are certain things where the United States will take action on, and one of those is if Assad uses chemical weapons against his own people, which he subsequently did in Ghouta, right? Yep. And we did nothing. And that, I don't think anyone in the U.S. establishment at the time realized what message that sent to Assad. The sad thing is, guys, that nice people, benevolent people who think, intelligent people often cause the greatest damage. And there's a great book by a British author called, the author is Graham Greene. He wrote a great book called The Quiet American, about the beginnings of Vietnam, how American idealism leads down these horrible paths, right? And look, I mean, this is not a defense of Trump coming in. I'm just saying that there was a great deal of dissatisfaction. Now, fast forward, all right, now you think about it, a lot of guys like me served in Iraq, Afghanistan. You had the rise of ISIS. You have the liberal administration in the United States playing that down. Again, Obama called them junior varsity. So he let that problem blossom out of control. Tens of thousands of people die, all right, in the end, hundreds of thousands, because the United States didn't take action, soon enough. in my opinion. All right. And as the guy who was subsequently sent in 2015 to try and put a lid on ISIS when they were 30 kilometers away from Baghdad. Fast forward again, Afghanistan. Now, no one can blame Biden's administration for for Afghanistan completely, but the fall of Kabul, absolutely. The warning signs were there. He was getting warnings from his generals. There were 10,000 NATO troops in the country. I believe there were Germans among them, right? Even up to the end. They were training Afghan soldiers, and the Americans were providing security and still involved in counterinsurgency operations. I don't know, like we had a joke that ISAF stood for I Saw Americans Fighting, but that's okay. All right. We were there to provide that bulwark so that NATO could accomplish this really important mission. And by the way, that's not a slight on NATO. I am very much aware, as are most Americans, that the one time Article 5 has been validated was after 9/11. NATO stepped up to the plate to back the United States. So I'm very grateful for that. But the point is, we had 2,500 troops in the country in 2021. They were mostly special operations forces. They were conducting a critical mission. The administration was warned time and again by the senior general in country, a guy named Scotty Miller, who was a 4-star U.S. Special Forces general. If you pull these guys out, the whole pack of cards is going to fall. That seemed impossible to policymakers. 2,500 guys, how can they be holding things together? Well, they weren't holding things together by themselves. The Afghans were, the NATO guys were, but they were a sign of American resolve. And once they were pulled out, as they were in a hurry, and Bagram was shut down, which was one of the only ways that it was the most viable means for evacuation. That's when things started, the house of cards all came tumbling down, right? So I'm not, I think the Taliban winning in Afghanistan, who knows? Maybe that was something that was going to happen anyway. But the way it happened brings shame to the United States and policymakers involved in it. The way we left our Afghan partners hanging, and so many people suffered because of those rash decisions. But the arrogance afterwards of guys like Jake Sullivan, who's National Security Advisor, who said Afghanistan will not be my legacy. And they just refused to accept the mistakes they had made. So there was this kind of elitist, arrogant attitude that was clearly visible, I think, from those of us within the country, certainly in the military, that started to rankle. One more thing. Okay, fast forward, Ukraine, as you guys probably know, a topic close to my heart. I spent a year on the ground in Ukraine, doing two things: training Ukrainian soldiers close to the front line, because in their rush to go to defend their country, they emptied all of their training institutions. So every single instructor, and it would probably be the same in Germany, I'm sure. Alex, from the mentality of the guys you served with in the Bundeswehr, if your country was threatened, you're not going to be able to tell someone, hey, you stay here and teach school. Every single one of your comrades would be wanting to fight for their country, right? And it was the same in Ukraine. So the schools emptied out. They had no way to reconstitute once they started taking casualties. And so they relied a lot on foreign organizations or volunteer organizations like mine. We would move up behind the front lines, still within artillery range, out of direct fire range, and we would train soldiers brigade by brigade. And 80% of these guys had never even fired a weapon before, but they were coming off the front line, okay? And we were evacuating civilians from the front line. During that time, the Biden administration was just drip fed support. The mantra was, escalation. We misread Putin. And so what we did is we provided weapon systems in small enough numbers for the Russians to adapt, right? I'll give you an example. Alex, you know what HIMARS is? You're a former artillery, of course, right? So, it's a very capable rocket artillery system. It's very, it's received a lot of accolades. We gave them 12, and then we gave them 24, right? It's a tiny, tiny number. We should have flooded. And the Russians at first, the Ukrainians used those to great effect, but then the Russians adapted. They separated their supply line. They dispersed their supply lines. They moved their command and control nodes out of range. And then they figured out how to jam the GPS in those rockets because they're smart guys, right? And so they, within a few months, the HIMARS lost all of its advantage. Why didn't we provide more of them? Because we were scared of escalation. Meanwhile, the British and the French are giving them Storm Shadow, the long-range missiles.
Yep.
The French call them, and talking about lifting restrictions on hitting Russia. We never did that. And so I feel as though we contributed despite all our bombast, despite the billions of dollars, we weren't smart in how we supported Ukraine. We didn't understand Putin. We should have put him on the ropes right away. And now we're talking about negotiating. Trump's coming in talking about negotiating. You don't, as Churchill said, you don't negotiate with a lion when your head is in his mouth. We should pull out all the stops in the remaining 2 months. Yeah, sure. Give them long-range missiles. We want to put the Russians on the ropes because any ceasefire agreement that Trump's talking about this is not going to last for long. But my point is this. I'm sorry. My point is, look, I understand that in Germany and across the world, you're seeing a populist president who is mendacious, whose private life seems to be, apocalyptic. Who says these things about immigration and everything. I'm not defending him as a person. I don't think anyone in their right mind can like him as a person. But please understand that the American public they're not racist. They're not fascists. They care about the economy, and there are many people who are disgusted by our foreign policy in the last 2 decades. Last thing I'll say is, say what you will, but the previous Trump administration, fewer Americans and fewer foreigners died in America's wars than under any other president this century, to include Obama, all right, to include Biden. Fewer Americans and foreigners died. And that's a pretty good record.
Where do you think this whole thing is going to go? Because obviously our outlooks in Germany are quite apocalyptic. What's going to happen next? And obviously you have like a very strange construct with Elon Musk coming in, and we are already joking here. Oh, the army has to buy 500,000 Cybertrucks now, and I guess SpaceX is the new NASA. So where is this going, actually, in your opinion?
Well, I'm going to start with a digression. Actually, SpaceX is better than NASA. I mean, seriously. Alex, you're an engineer.
Probably it is.
Nope. I strongly disagree. They do stuff, but if you go into detail, there are lots of things to do which you do not see if you look at the shiny big rocket going up, which compensates something, I think. You still not have the payload you need. There has to be a lot of rework. And the most important thing when you compare SpaceX to a national space agency, no government would be able to tell their people why we are letting this stuff explode all the time. Yeah. Neither NASA nor ESA could develop rockets like this anymore. They did this in the past, where it was okay to fight against the Russians. Werner von Braun with the Saturn V program did it like that, which was fine at the time. But with these tight budgets they have at the moment, you could never develop like SpaceX. SpaceX says hardware-rich development. Well, if I have the money, then it's okay. But there is a lot of work to do before this rocket will be human-rated. This will not happen within the next 5 years, is my guess.
Well, you're the expert. I'm throwing stuff
this
out
is This is my personal opinion. I'm not really into the details, but
no, Yeah, I think that's a great, and there's also accountability, right? There's no, NASA has accountability as a government agency. I'm sorry, I'm digressing, but I agree with you. But the only point I made was, I know I'm familiar because I've had to write about this. NASA is struggling with the problem of replacing satellites. Yes. Small expendable satellites, and SpaceX is ahead of NASA in solving that problem. That's all I meant.
The Falcon 9 rocket is a workhorse. This thing is a money machine, right? But I think SpaceX launched more payload in the last years than all of the national space agencies together, including the Chinese, and they're coming up with the payload. This is not the point, but if you focus on Starship, I think there's a lot of firework around to show you how cool this thing is, and you do not see the problems because nobody talks about it. The media can't, because they are not qualified to tell you that, for example, the everything inside this rocket at the moment is fuel. But you do not want to burn fuel to throw a cigar out of metal around the world. That does not bring you anything. It does not get satellites into an orbit. You need payload. And Elon talked about 250 tons, something like that. And they're far away from this. The rocket is awesome. The engines are awesome. This is one of the most advanced engines in the world. But the way which is still to go is not as short as it seems to be when you're listening to Elon. The space community uses the term Elon time when it comes to launch dates. So I totally agree with you. It's the project is awesome. I really like the pictures they produce. But at the moment, they're doing a big firework.
Anyway,
that's why you have an expert like Alex to bring renegade, ignorant guests here back to
reinforce on my question. Should we Germans be scared now that Trump is president? Like, is NATO falling apart?
Okay, short answer. No, I do not believe so. All right, and this is not based purely on ignorance. It's hopefully not at all on ignorance. Okay.
I had my tequila.
I mean, I'm not in the system anymore. But but I do have, we on the podcast. By the way, I just want a quick plug for a podcast that I host called Eyes On, on YouTube. Please, and hopefully you guys will be kind enough to put a link there. But in the previous episode, we brought on he's actually a friend of mine, former Marine, who worked in the Trump administration. As Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Middle East. But my point is, he has friends who are coming in who are projected to come in this current administration. So what I'm saying here is, yes, you hear a lot of wild comments from Trump about NATO, about alliances, et cetera, et cetera. But remember that the people coming in, they have grown up with NATO. Whether they have many criticisms of it, but I have not heard a single Trump acolyte say that United States should pull out of NATO. Now, the concerns are this. You guys are familiar with this, of course, percentage of GDP, expenditure, the feeling that, and I'm not saying this is my feeling. My feeling is money is cheap compared to lives. I don't give a shit how much money we, United States, spend on alliances. It's still cheap, right? NATO is worth it. NATO's worth it even if no one else steps up to the plate. But selling that to the American public, it's the sell is, hey, your taxes are high because we're defending Europe. And look, hey, Europe's there are many countries in Europe that are European that are economic powerhouses who have not even met the NATO minimum GDP expenditure. All right, I'm just saying that's their argument. No, absolutely. I can tell you that the United States, almost with certainty, no one can use certainty with Trump, is not going to back down or pull out of NATO, because he is reminded time and again by his advisors, what I just mentioned earlier in our discussion, that the one time NATO has activated Article 5 was in defense of the United States. I mean, it was nominal, but it meant something when it came to Afghanistan.
So
and
what
there's
does it
much more than
mean for
that.
Ukraine, in your opinion? So he's
Okay,
going to
so
do a deal, and then Ukraine has to basically seize territory, or how is it going?
yeah, I mean, this is my biggest concern, to be honest with you. Just one more thing on NATO. Okay, there is a plus side. There is a plus side to this fear of Trump, right? Look what the polls have done in the last year. Not just because in anticipation of Trump coming into power, the polls have raised their expenditure to 4% of GDP. They're a military powerhouse on the eastern flank of NATO right now. I mean, have you been watching what the polls are doing, expanding their armed forces, building them up? They've got a cyber capability that is second to none. They're doing stuff, special operations, which I can tell you they're doing stuff that would surprise you already against Russia. Okay. Same thing with the Baltic states. So beneath the radar, Europe is stepping up to the plate in anticipation of filling a gap that the United States might leave. I don't think that's a negative thing. I think that's hugely positive. All right. But back to your question, Ukraine really does trouble me, and here's why. Remember I said, the whole thing about negotiation, lesson number one is you need to be in a position of strength, right? So what we did is we drip fed all this stuff to the Ukrainians. They had a failed offensive, not just because stuff was drip fed. There was a number of other issues, but the offensive failed. Now it's a stalemate. All right. Neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians can get that from here. And the scale of casualties, as we know, is horrific. Killing on both sides. Anyone who doesn't want that to stop is not in their right mind. But the wrong thing now is to negotiate. I mean, who thinks they can trust Putin? All right. Who thinks they can trust Putin to a frozen conflict? And the terms of the negotiation, the terms of the settlement that I think the Trump administration had proposed are that battle lines are frozen in place. There is a 20-year moratorium on Ukraine coming into NATO. Unanswered question, what support in the meantime is provided to Ukraine militarily to help build them up? Obviously, that's not going to work. Anyone who's a realist knows that a settlement like that is not going to work. Putin's going to run all over it. He's going to undermine it. All right. And those lines are going to keep creeping forward, and casualties are going to continue happening. So I strongly disagree with the proposal for any kind of settlement in Ukraine. But the fact remains that the killing it's difficult to describe to someone who hasn't been there and seen the scale of what's going on. And obviously I was never in the First World War. I was never in any other war, but I spent 20 something years in conflict on behalf of the United States. Nothing I saw in that time came close to what I have seen in Ukraine. And on the Ukrainian side, they just cannot afford to sustain that. They've lost so many of the best men and women in this war. It's heartbreaking. So what is the solution? I say the solution is go all out. Yes, Britain and France should supply, they should empty the shells of Storm Shadow. The United States should lift the restrictions on hitting Russia. Bring the war home to Russia. Okay, military targets, yeah, but bring the war home, because only then is Putin going to start to feel domestic pressure, all right? And flood that battlefield with U.S. weapons. That's what I would do if I was Biden in the remaining 2 months. Okay, trainers, yeah, get them in Ukraine. Whatever we can do to help them reconstitute their military, and the Trump administration should continue that policy until Putin starts yelling no mas. But he's not yelling that now. He's saying, "Oh yeah, I'll think about negotiation," because of course he is. He can sell what the Russians have done now as a win, even though both of you and I know that what he holds in Ukraine isn't going to do him much good. It's ruined 20% part of the country.
Yeah, well, they called it the greatest miscalculation on political scale in the last likely 50 years. And I would agree. Like, he totally miscalculated. and now it's a never-ending shit show, so to speak.
He miscalculated, but we miscalculated too.
Yeah, of course, I would agree.
Continuously.
And I should mention, I lived 6 months in Kiev, so I would say I know the people to a degree, actually. And side note again, when the whole crap started, I took a car, and on day 2 or 3, I drove my friends out personally. So I have some field experience, I would say, not on your scale. I'm not a military man. Basically, I'm just a fearless lunatic.
That's closer than most people ever come.
Basically,
good on you.
Interesting question. Side note, because it's quite heavy. Like your life is anything but stress less. I would say. What does Andy Milburn do for fun to rewind? Like, because obviously you cannot go on like this for 24 hours, right?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I've got to tell you, I've changed my lifestyle totally in the last year. I don't drink alcohol. I meditate.
Sponsorship by Budweiser, Alex.
Fun?
Nothing. Sorry, Andy.
I quit drinking 18 months ago, and it was not it wasn't like, I was an alcoholic, I had to go to rehab. But I was in Ukraine, and I was drinking a lot. I was drinking. Well, I mean, part of that's the culture. Part of it was the life we were living. Where I was in Donbass. We would come back to the hotel at night, and not to be melodramatic, but my hands were shaking so much I could not get the hotel key in the hotel in the door. All right, not from alcohol. That's before I started drinking, just from the fear and the stress. And the only way the two things helped me calm down. One was just talking to the people I was with. We would sit down, and the other was, I would drink. I mean, I probably got through maybe half a bottle of vodka, which is a lot for me a night. And then when I left Ukraine, I just realized I didn't like what that had done to me. My health, I was a different person. A lot of it was probably just the effects of a year of being in that environment. But I was angry. I was lashing out at people, not physically, but especially. But I was a mess. And so I began by just giving up alcohol, and that was probably I wish I'd done it before. I mean, everything changed about my life. I slept better. I lost my temper. I mean, not lost my temper. I lost my proclivity to lose my temper. Yeah. Although I still get angry at people, I become shit. But I started to meditate, and I know this sounds very new world, but I started listening to a dude named Joe Dispenza, who does a lot of, because it's difficult to meditate, right? I mean, my mind's all over the place. And so I had to follow kind of a program, but it got me into a much better place. I feel like I'm a more relaxed, more loving, more compassionate person than I've ever been in my life. So that's part of the answer. Physical fitness has always been a release to me. I'm not a super athlete or anything, but I every day I do something, and I don't follow a program. I do what I feel like, but whether it's swimming or riding a bike or concept 2 rowing, and that gets the blood flowing. It makes me feel better. And reading, I'm a voracious reader. I carve out at least an hour or so a day and read.
What's your favorite book?
I read. Yeah, actually, it's right in one of my favorite authors. I don't really have a favorite author, but I love reading books. I don't read fiction, but I don't read a lot of military stuff. I love reading biographies, autobiographies, and I'm fascinated. A lot of stuff I read, I realize, is by journalists. There's a book in front of me called The Making of the Modern Middle East by a BBC journalist called Jeremy Bowen, who, by the way, is excellent in his coverage of what's happening now in Gaza, what has led to it. Bowen, Bowen, and I love that. I like because I spent all my life in the military, I particularly like reading a view of life that is not a military view, but a view of geopolitics or of local problems. I read one of my favorite books, actually, that I've read a number of times, is a military book. But it's a very humorous book, and when I tell you what it's about, you're going to wonder how it's humorous. It's called Quartered Safe Out Here. It's by a guy called George MacDonald Fraser, and he wrote a series called the Flashman series that is hugely popular in Britain and the United States. When I say George MacDonald Fraser, most people say, "Oh, yeah, the Flashman series." But when he was 18, he was in Burma fighting the Japanese in the 14th Army, a very junior rifleman. And Quartered Safe Out Here is about his year in Burma. Obviously very heavy combat against a very vicious enemy. But the book is hilarious, the way he writes, the way he captures things. And it is for that I really enjoy it. You know, the human interactions in that book. You guys, you know, Alex will relate to this. I mean, you think back to why you were in the military. What did you like most about the military, Alex?
The comradeship.
Exactly, right?
It's the people you work with.
Yeah.
You rely on them. You know, everybody works for the same purpose. You have different opinions. They are all different people, but you have a common goal at the horizon. Sometimes you think some people don't work for this goal, but in the end effect, it's the same goal, and this gives purpose. Something many companies talk about today. We need purpose in our jobs, and military has purpose inherent. It's simply there, and this compensates for a lot.
Have you found that in the civilian world?
No, not in that way, because you do not have the same experience with the people you work with in the civilian world. I started as an artillery officer. I had my first. I worked on the. We were trained on the M109, the howitzer, and one of the guys of the crew was. I'm still befriended with him. It's one of my best friends, and you know people from the military in a different way than from the civilian life. You can compare this, for example, the firemen and the medics sometimes have similar experience with their colleagues, because they're in very, very stressful situations, and you know the people when all the comfort of civilization is stripped away, and you're in a situation where you have to work with the other person, or in your situations you die if you're really in combat. But if you're working with artillery shells, you have to be careful too. So
the stakes are very high.
Yes. And it's the same if you jump out of an airplane. You have to rely on the person who prepared your chute, as it is in the German military. When you jump automatically, you have to trust your comrade, and this kind of trust can't be found in most of the civilian jobs. There are some of the jobs are like this, but most of them aren't, and you can't force this by any team event or something like that. Team events give you a glimpse of this, a small light of how comradeship works, but it does not get to the core. It's my personal opinion about this.
Alex summed that up beautifully. I mean, that really is, and I'm not just saying that. That is, I've seldom heard anyone be able to say that so succinctly, but he's absolutely 100% right. And George MacDonald Fraser, in this one book, makes you understand that without explaining it. The way he describes his squad, you know, by the end, but you know that squad by the end of the book. You know it as well as he does. You know, you can even predict what someone's going to do within that squad, and it's a beautiful piece of work. And it's if you have a sense of humor, you'll find yourself laughing almost on every page. And I think that, it's a very interesting observation, and it's particularly highlighted in the conscript army, as of course the British army was every army was during the Second World War, but we don't see that anymore. But it doesn't matter. I think I've met so many people who leave the military and spend the rest of their lives looking for that same sense of purpose, that same comradeship. So it's an important point. And that's, in answer to your question, that's the sort of book that I really enjoy.
Okay, so I'll sum it up, and then we can close the cast. I guess we're roughly at an hour, if everybody's fine with that.
Already.
Yeah, that was about an hour, plus minus 5 minutes. And I would to add something what Andy said. I would put on two quotes. One by Charlie Chaplin, "In the end, everything is a gag," and the second one by Robin Williams, "Reality, what a concept." Basically. And yeah, that was our second video podcast. With us still is the great Andy Milburn, and we were discussing everything from very bad British food over United States Marines to what books he likes.
Can I put in? I really like this book. The author's a shithead.
The author is great. He's very good looking and young too.
I want your audience to demand that this gets translated into German.
Yeah, sure. So Andy also has as we discussed, an absolutely great podcast. Link will be in the description. I will also put into a link for his book and every other available link there is about him. That might be a bit much. I guess those two will do. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us and introducing yourself and your opinions to the German audience. I'm sure they're having a blast. And thank you as well, Alex, for being here and having to see my face in the evening. I know it's a bit dicey regarding your appetite, but there we are. And lastly, do you want to add anything, Andy? Do you want to add anything, Alex?
Alex, you go first.
The guest always goes first.
Oh, okay. Hey, no, fellas, this was a lot of fun. I wish, I'd love to meet you guys in real life. Maybe, who knows, I'll find myself passing through Germany. But in any case, it was great pleasure. And I hope your audience enjoys it. And my best luck to both of you. I have the kudos to your podcast. I think aside from me, I think it's a great show. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Andy, for your time. It was a pleasure.